When 37-year-old Renee Nicole Good was shot and killed by an ICE agent in Minneapolis on January 7th, Americans across the country took notice. The video of her shooting went viral, and almost instantaneously, two different versions of what really happened took hold. In one version, the ICE agent was righteously defending his own life with the shooting. In the other, a federal officer had criminally shot and killed an innocent woman. Hello and welcome to USA Today's The Excerpt. I'm Dana Taylor. Since that fateful day, protests have erupted across the nation in what some are saying is parallel to the outrage felt across the nation when George Floyd was killed. In fact, the shooting happened not so far from where Floyd was killed 6 years ago. Has a tide turned for how Americans feel about immigration enforcement? Here to help us dig into all of it is USA Today breaking news reporter Christopher Cann. Chris, thanks
Thanks
so
for
much for
having
being
me.
here. Let's first take a step back and recap what happened on January 7th, the day Renee Nicole Good was killed.
On the morning of January 7th, Renee Nicole Good was with her wife and dog. They say driving on their way home from dropping off their child at school. When they say they came across federal agents in their neighborhood south of downtown Minneapolis, engaging in operations there, that's when they began observing what was going on and filming. At some point there, that's when videos, the ones that you had mentioned that had gone viral, start to show that federal agents had approached Renee in her SUV. One can be seen walking up to her, saying expletives, telling her to get out of the car, and that's when she began backing up before pulling her car forward while turning her wheel seemingly away from agents. And one ICE agent, Jonathan Ross, who is standing in videos near the front of the SUV when it's moving, shot and killed Renee. So the widely seen footage of that deadly encounter has sharply divided the country. DHS officials have said that Jonathan Ross acted properly and that Good was engaging in domestic terrorism, while top Democrats have called for Ross's arrest and have accused him of illegally shooting a U.S. citizen. And I'll also note that there's new polls that find that most Americans have found the shooting to be unjustified.
The days that followed have been marked by chaotic clashes between federal agents and protesters. In fact, there was a second shooting just 2 days ago on January 14th that has intensified demonstrations. What happened there, Chris?
So on this past Wednesday night, federal officials say immigration agents were operating in Minneapolis. When they say a man fled from agents first in his car and then on foot, and when an agent caught up with him, a scuffle ensued. And federal officials say that it's at that time when two men from a nearby apartment building had arrived and assaulted the agent. And the agent, allegedly being attacked by three people, shot one of the men. Today, the Department of Homeland Security identified all of them as undocumented immigrants from Venezuela and defended the agent's actions, saying that those shots were fired defensively. State investigators say they've launched a separate independent probe into the use of force in that case. But either way, the news of that shooting spread pretty quickly Wednesday night and intensified those protests, with scuffles breaking out, scenes of vandalism in some case, clouds of tear gas and pepper spray.
Yesterday, President Donald Trump threatened to invoke the Insurrection Act. What authority would that give the president?
So the Insurrection Act gives the president authority to deploy U.S. troops domestically. And the way the law is written, that's supposed to be used to suppress rebellions, civil unrest, or used when federal laws are being obstructed. And so the law has been revoked about 30 times since the late 1700s. The most recent time it was invoked was in 1992 during the riots in Los Angeles. And Trump has a history of musing about invoking the Insurrection Act. He has since he's returned to office last year, and he's also spoke about using it in the wake of the killing of George Floyd in 2020.
The Department of Homeland Security has sent about 3,000 federal agents into the Minneapolis area, dwarfing the local police presence. How have state and local officials in Minnesota, including Governor Tim Walz, responded?
State and local officials, from Tim Walz to Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey, have repeatedly called for ICE to leave the area. They call what's happening a federal invasion, accuse agents of trouncing on people's rights and unlawful seizures. The state actually filed a lawsuit this week seeking to halt the immigration operations in Minnesota. A judge declined to issue an immediate restraining order that would stop the ongoing enforcement, but the Department of Homeland Security has until Monday to respond to the lawsuit. So we'll see what happens there and whether or not see what the judge decides as far as the ongoing enforcement.
And then earlier this week, 6 federal prosecutors resigned following pressure by the Justice Department to investigate Renee Nicole Good's widow. Why and how has that impacted the political climate surrounding the shooting?
While there's unrest in the streets in Minneapolis and Minnesota more broadly, there's turmoil within the prosecutor's office there. As you mentioned, reports say that 6 prosecutors have resigned after they had faced pressure to investigate Good's wife. There was also disagreement around the DOJ's decision not to investigate Jonathan Ross, the agent who shot Good in her SUV, as well as the handling of the incident. And this all comes as the state is facing a lot of pressure regarding a fraud scandal in Minnesota. And one of those prosecutors who resigned was Joe Thompson. He was the acting U.S. attorney for Minnesota. He had been appointed by Trump, and he had led the probe that had uncovered a lot of fraud within 14 state-run Medicaid programs.
It's been nearly 6 years since the death of George Floyd, and our colleagues have written about how people in Minneapolis are feeling re traumatized by this incident. What's happening on the ground, and what are people saying?
As you mentioned, the shooting of Good happened less than a mile from where George Floyd was killed in 2020. And as you remember in that case as well, it was a video of that incident that had shocked the nation, sparked large scale protests in cities across the country. And there was a kind of a national reckoning with police brutality and use of force. And so we have another deadly law enforcement interaction that's again shocked people, fueled this upswell of activism and protests there. So you have a lot of people who've, lived through that time and are currently protesting now or not, and thinking back, and it kind of has re-traumatized them, has kind of brought them back into that headspace maybe that they were in the wake of the killing of George Floyd. So we're seeing, of course, these large protests in Minneapolis. They've not been, at least so far, to the scale of the ones in the wake of George Floyd, at least as far as the unrest and scenes of vandalism and things like that. Actors there have talked about it being much more controlled. So you'll have these, large protests maybe outside a federal building in Minneapolis, but then there'll be also demonstrators or what they call legal advisors following ICE and DHS agents around the city, blowing whistles, honking horns to notify people in the area that ICE is there, also recording on their phones and cataloging what's happened. So you have kind of these roving demonstrations, along with the more stationary ones.
Compared to 2020, USA Today is reporting that protests today are more disciplined and deliberate, even as the anger and exhaustion remain. What lessons did activists and protest organizers say they learned from the George Floyd uprising? And how is that shaping how they respond now?
So there's a lot of differences between the protests that occurred in the immediate wake of the killing of George Floyd and what's currently happening in Minneapolis. The ones happening at the moment are, a lot of them are being led by groups. Some of them were formed in the wake of George Floyd's killing, and you have these, kind of stationary protests, maybe outside a federal building, and then others that have a more roaming aspect to them, where they maybe follow ICE agents and DHS patrols as they're conducting enforcement across the city. And then there, people are, standing and just recording on their phones what's happening. That's actually been something that Governor Tim Walz has come out and encouraged people to do. He said this week that he's asked people to record as much video as they can of ICE agents and DHS agents conducting their operations, and kind of indicated they might be used for future prosecution. But as the protests in the wake of the George Floyd killing were immediately reactionary. There seems to be more of an apparatus in this instance in the organization of the protest.
Our reporters say that people in Minneapolis are exhausted, but they're still showing up. What have activists said about how they're balancing that fatigue and the feeling that they don't really have the option to step away?
Many Minnesota residents say that while they feel exhausted, they still feel that they must go out and protest, decry what's happening, because they feel there's no other choice. Many are worried not only for maybe immigrants in their cities, but also for themselves, with a lot of concerns around unlawful stops and possible discrimination. So while yes, there's a lot of fatigue and maybe apprehension, I also think that there's a large history of activism in Minneapolis, and so I think people there almost feel an obligation to speak out about injustices.
What happens next here, Chris? What will you be looking for?
We'll be watching, what happens with these protests. If they continue, it seems that the ICE operations, the broader ICE and Border Patrol operations, aren't going to be slowing. On Thursday, Kristi Noem said that there's no intention to pull out or stop the immigration enforcement or cancel it anytime soon. So that looks like it will be continuing for the foreseeable future.
Christopher Cann is a breaking news reporter for USA Today. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Chris.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for watching. I'm Dana Taylor. I'll see you next time.